All right, folks. Thank you for joining me here today. Welcome. If you're not sure if you're in the right room, then you're in the right room. Okay, we call that an icebreaker. All right. So welcome. As you may have noticed, I am the Riddler. You may also know me as Enigma or Mr. E. But since I'm traveling here from a different universe and you are all citizens of the Marvel Universe, I can safely tell you that my secret identity is Robert Herbig, AI Practice Lead. I work for a medium-sized software consultancy. We build custom software. And in the course of work on AI and leading projects, I deal with a lot of uncertainty. So here we are today. All right. Please don't hesitate to ask questions, those in the remote rooms. I asked the proctor to interrupt me, and I'm asking you here in the live audience to also interrupt me. It helps me know if I need to dig in deeper somewhere. So Discord, raise your hand. It is really hard to see, so you may have to yell something to get my attention. But please don't hesitate to ask questions. All right, so let's talk about uncertainty. We all face uncertainty every day. Raise your hand if you've ever been caught in traffic, despite Apple or Google Maps telling you it was a straight shot. Okay, a few hand raises. Or the weather, whether through an app or anything else, may have been wrong. These things happen. Yes. And so sometimes we face uncertainty in mundane situations, although not unimportant. But I would posit that in our professional lives, we often face uncertainty in the course of something like this, where we're asked, when will it be done? Anyone been asked that question? All right. Who answered that question? And who felt good about their answer? Yeah. So, now, of course, we can certainly turn to some tried and true tools like this. This is one of my favorites. Didn't quite come across as much as I'd hoped on the big screen, but this is a Gantt chart, the humble Gantt chart of when the Batman might be done with his bat suit. Raise your hand if you ever used one of these. Okay, and did you feel good about what it said at the end? And the hands go down. Okay. So this is some of the challenges that we face and some of the tools that aren't getting us where we need to be with uncertainty. So I'm a big fan of big idea up front. So I'm going to go ahead and give away the structure of the talk. I'm going to talk about uncertainty and how we can think probabilistically, how we can use probabilistic forecasting as a technique to help address the uncertainty that we face, how we can communicate that uncertainty to people who aren't attending this talk and therefore not as experienced in this area, and then we'll go through applying all this to a case study of a project that I just wrapped up. So starting with probabilistic thinking. All of probabilistic thinking starts in one place, with I don't know. These are my kids. They saw me working on this talk, and they said, how can I help? And if you've ever had kids ask how you can help, sometimes it might be a little hard to find the proper place for them to help. But I said, ham it up. This is where I'm starting with this talk. It's the most important part. It's the cornerstone of everything is I don't know. Ham it up. And they did. So I really am proud of them for that. And that's hard, I think, for most of us in this profession, because saying I don't know, sometimes it's a little bit of a hit to the ego. Sometimes it's acknowledging a very uncomfortable reality. And we're a knowledge profession who often, whether we admit it or not, pride ourselves on knowing. And so we're often also under pressure to be decisive or to answer that question. So holding the line and saying I don't know is not a failure, but it is the first step to answering the question that we were asked. This is Annie Duke. She wrote the book Thinking in Bets. Excellent book. I'll recommend a few as we go, so I recommend reading this one. And in short, what makes a decision great is not that it has a great outcome, that is, the wrong direction to look at it. Rather, a great decision is the result of a good process, and that process must include an attempt to represent our state of knowledge, and that state of knowledge must include I don't know. So I tried to capture it a little pithier on my slide, but it's important to recognize it here. And so by starting with I don't know, we have to recognize that luck and skill both contribute to the actual outcome. The best decisions can result in undesirable outcomes. So imagine a spectrum here, where on the one side, that side over there, we have Candyland, a game of pure luck. Anyone ever played Candyland with your kids or nephews or relatives, and maybe they lost and they felt bad, so you tried to throw the next game? Right? You can't. You cannot throw the game. It is a purely luck-based game. You shuffle the deck, the game is decided. Done. And on the far opposite end of the spectrum, you have a game of pure skill. Chess, perfect information. It is brain against brain. You can make errors, certainly. Mistakes can happen. But it is a game of pure skill. In the middle, though, that's where the interesting things are, and that's where we live, is in the middle somewhere. Now, I usually talk about euchre because I'm from Indiana. Does euchre work here? Okay, all right, excellent. And so that is the kind of game where there is an element of skill. I think that is undeniable. But there is also some element of random chance. And that is the interesting part. That is where these tools really apply. Because the same decision in the same situation may not have the same outcome. And that is what we have to understand. So luck and skill contribute to outcomes. An important part of that is recognizing that there is more than one possible outcome and that they're not equally likely. I'm going to introduce a character now. This is Blockbuster. He is not the brightest villain on the blockbuster, if you will. And I say that as the Riddler, the brightest villain of them all. Now, he is a member of the, and I'm going to make sure I quote this, the Secret Society of Supervillains. That's the real name. Again, probably not their brightest choice in naming it that way. But Blockbuster here is making a bet. His bet that if he smashes Gotham City, he will profit. Now, he thinks deterministically. One thing, he makes a decision, there is one outcome. But he missed something very important. And that's the possibility being stopped by the Batman. With probabilistic thinking, we need to brainstorm each of the possible outcomes, and we need to apply our judgment to think about the likelihood of these outcomes. Now, I don't know about you, of those two percentages, but I suspect we could all agree that one of those is more likely than the other. Fair enough? Okay. So Batman is probably more likely to win at the end of the day. And so that's our first step towards bringing uncertainty under control. This one pains me to show it, but it's not my most flattering side. But bringing it under control, we're going to use a tool called probabilistic forecasting. Back to our humble Gantt chart. I think we all agreed, based on the quick survey of the room in the beginning, that the Gantt chart is not the answer. It might feel good. Raise your hand. Anyone feel good when they put a Gantt chart together and said, look how pretty this graph is? I know I feel real excited to see everything lay out, even if it's not realistic. But it doesn't reflect reality. Gantt charts foster the wrong conversations. They hide conversations we need to have. All right. So probabilistic forecasting is an answer to that. Let's go back to those maps. This is a good example of a probabilistic forecast. Now, it's got a couple things that I take issue with, but it's a pretty good example. And one of the things I like, so this slide is from when I gave this talk in Kansas City. Apologies, I forgot to update it for here. But the cool part was it gave me multiple routes, so it gave me multiple options. It showed me variations in them. It allowed me to configure things. For example, I could walk to Kansas City if I wanted to, which I don't recommend. You'll get a good workout, but you'll probably get there too late for the conference. But that configurability, the multiple options, the assumptions are shown in each of those. You can might be a little hard to see, but there's a warning sign next to one of them that says, you know, there might be some error here. These kinds of things make for good forecasts. Now let's look at another one that's probably a little bit more directly applicable to many people, and that's a weather forecast. In this particular case, it's a forecast of the path of Hurricane Sandy from, wow, 10 plus years ago. I feel a little old now looking at the actual date there. Feels like it was yesterday. But an important thing to note here is that there are several aspects of this that we're going to go over and look at to see what makes for a good forecast, and then we can apply that to software. So the first thing is that it shows multiple options. Each of those dots is a data point along a path. Each of those colored line segments between dots taken as a whole path, represents one possible future that has been predicted. So we have multiple options here. Now, unlike the navigation case, we're not choosing between them. Wouldn't it be nice if we could? But we are using multiple different scenarios, assumptions, and those kinds of things to predict different paths to come up with those options. It's clear about the level of uncertainty. Now, if you're in software, you might have heard of the cone of uncertainty. This is kind of that same concept. The level of confidence and the level of uncertainty that we have. And so what you notice is that those points are more tightly clustered at the front, and they are far more spread out at the end. And so we can very easily see, and I think I actually drew it on here. Yep, there we go. The red bars represent a very visual way to see how confident we are about each of these things. So the red bar at the very beginning, near the certain short term, is much shorter than the red bar at the end at the less certain long term. The width of the majority of data points has changed, and we can easily see the uncertainty. It can be tested against the actual outcome. So this is extremely important. You might notice your map tool of choice doing this as you go on your journey. You might recalculate or do something like that. I think we've all seen that happen. And so what happens here in the hurricane example is as time goes on, there we go, each of those dots represents an actual data point for the path of the hurricane as time went on. So we can take our forecast and we can look at those dots inside that cone, and we can say, hey, are we even in the right ballpark? How far off are we? Are our assumptions dramatically wrong? If the dots line up pretty close to the center, then we're probably getting the right confidence interval, the right variation on each side. And if the dots start to exceed those yellow bounding lines, then our assumptions are way off. Something is fundamentally wrong, and we need to change it. And it must be updated as time goes on. So again, this is a snapshot at one point in time, and you can see that the span of projected landfall is anywhere from Virginia to Mass. This is a snapshot from later on, and you can see that the cone of uncertainty has narrowed considerably. So we've updated it as time went on, as we gathered more information, and as we found out which of those paths was more realistic. And now the gap in landfall is Delaware to New Jersey, so it's considerably shorter. And of course, that lets us plan against this better. And so probabilistic forecasting shows multiple options with their confidence. It lets us test the actual outcome against the forecast and update it as we learn new things. So let's look at software, because hurricanes are one thing. Does anybody work for NOAA or a weather company? All right, so we'll pull this back into the software domain. Let's look at this point of showing multiple options. How can we do that with the projects that we're executing on right now? So let's take this example. Our initial backlog is 25 stories, and our velocity is 3 stories per sprint. Anyone seen a beautiful burn down chart like this before? Yeah, okay, lots of head nodding. Maybe made one, maybe you've lived one. Did reality play out exactly like this? No, okay. And so, I only ask leading questions, of course. It's the best way to do it. And it's because there are a few flaws with this model. We might make some assumptions and come up with this, but we need to talk about how we can apply these probabilistic thinking to something like this. And the first thing is that the single values don't tell the whole story. If anyone was in Eric Potter's talk earlier today on better ways to estimate, this is that same principle that he was talking about. We need to work in ranges. Now, there's a variety of reasons why we might lean on a single point answer and why ranges are better. So we'll go over that. There we go. The first is that the backlog is not exactly 25. It is 20 to 30. We have scope changes. New work comes up. We have bugs. We have tech debt, things like that. And so if we start by plotting 2 different lines, at least with the extremes of 20 stories versus 30 stories, we can begin to see a difference in realities that might occur, in future outcomes that might happen. And you can already see there's a pretty wide difference from 8 sprints versus 11 sprints. That's a pretty big difference. And if we do the same thing with velocity, whether that's unexpected complexity coming up, we have to work in a new area we aren't familiar with, and so we slow our pace while we learn and catch up, illness, vacations, the bus factor, or the lottery factor, depending on what you like to call it, the team shape changes or the makeup changes, right? All these different reasons may result in a variation in velocity. And so now we can plot at least the 4 extremes, right? The 2x2 matrix, if you will, between stories and velocity. And now we're starting to get a bigger picture. The earliest it might be done is 6 sprints. There's a world in which that is possible. But there's also a world in which that blue line just goes off the chart, and it's even worse, right? Okay. Emphasis. This is important. All right. And by looking at multiple outcomes and plotting those multiple outcomes, this is a more principled way of analyzing what the different options might be and what they look like. Now, it was very tempting when we were talking about single point estimates to do something like 25 stories or 3 stories per sprint. But that is an average of that range. And in order to use an average, a couple things have to be true. The members of the population must be statistically independent, and this is rarely the case in engineering or software development. How often have you had a story get delayed or scope grown and it only affects a single story? Anybody? 0 hands. Okay, great. And that's what I thought, leading questions. That's because the work that we do is very tightly coupled. And the more you break down stories, the smaller, the more of them will be affected. And so we have this interrelationship. The other problem with using averages is that it only works easily in that, like min plus max over 2 way for normal distributions. And there is literature that suggests that a lot of software development is not a normal distribution. So I'm not going to go into that. I need a whole other hour, and that's a different talk. But Glenn Alleman here, increasing the probability of project success, some interesting stuff on that topic. You can read more there about whether it is a normal distribution or whether it's not. But that is why averages are not the tool that we should be reaching for. All right, back to this story, or this scenario here. We can start filling in with some of these other pieces too. What we've done is we've taken 4 variations based on our stories, our backlog, and our velocity. But there are many other possibilities, right? Any number between 20 and 30, let's at least keep it to integers for now, for the simplicity, is a valid backlog in this possible world that we're looking at. And any number between 2 and 4, again, hopefully integers, is also valid. So if we repeat this process again and again, what we can actually end up with, I hope that is more visible for you folks than it is for me down here, because I can't really make out much, but you get a probability cloud. Each of these lines represents a possible future, and together they represent all of the futures for those parameters that we gave it. What we've done is we've sampled from the distributions of backlog and velocity over and over a bunch of times until we can see the shape of this. And so the earliest date is January 29th, and the latest is March 12th. And so we can now begin to understand the range of possible delivery dates for this particular scenario. Now, if you're familiar with it, what I've done is I've recreated Monte Carlo simulation from first principles here. Anyone heard of that? Raise your hand. Okay, good. Excellent. That's more than usual. This is great. It's named for the Monte Carlo Casino in Monaco. Again, I could spend a whole other hour talking about the intricacies of the Monte Carlo method, but the short of it is that a principled way to approach tackling distributions that we can't just average is to sample from them over and over. Now, this is Douglas Hubbard, who wrote How to Measure Anything, another book I would recommend, although maybe just read it piecemeal, read the pieces that seem relevant. Running Monte Carlo is the only way to analyze big, uncertain decisions. So this is a model using probability ranges or distributions to sample from them and then put that together into something. Now, of course, being software engineers, none of us want to do this by hand, and so I want to point out that there is a tool. And I know I try to be very agile in all the work I do, and agile principles, right? Interactions and conversations over tools and processes. That doesn't mean we disregard the tools. And this is simply automating that thing that we just backed into from first principles by hand. So I want to take a minute to give a shout out to my friend Troy here. Great guy. He's got a tool that automates this process of sort of setting up the parameters and then running the Monte Carlo simulation. Any tool will work. This is the principle that I'm really focused on here. And so for his tool, what we might do is we might start with the stories remaining. We can give it a range. Split rate is a little bit of nuance. He's written a number of blog posts on what split rate means, but think about it as when you pick a story out of the backlog, does it remain one story? Has anyone ever had a story split, whether just to make the work easier to flow, lots of hands? Okay, exactly. And so modeling that is something that turns out to be important, and the forecast tends to be sensitive to it. And then throughput is simply a worst, most often, best case distribution. Think of it like a triangle distribution. You can skew the middle. But with these parameters, it will run this forecasting scenario for you. It will give you this. Now, sometimes this is a little hard to explain to stakeholders. So what it'll also do is build a histogram. And so this histogram represents possible delivery dates. And as you can see, that with this particular scenario, there is certainly one delivery date that is way early, there on April 2nd. But you can see where the majority of them sort of peak. And you can see how it doesn't form exactly a normal distribution. That's just a thing that happens sometimes when you're sampling from ranges. And then there's a long tail for the worst cases. And so this is a lot easier to show a stakeholder. But I like this view. And so this is simply a summation of the histogram, what percent of the possible futures are on this date or before it. And so you can think about this as the likelihood that we will actually deliver on a given date. The green section, the 85 to 100%, is very risk averse. There's yellow, if you're willing to take a bit more of a chance. And then there's red, which means you should not even consider doing this unless the date doesn't actually matter. In which case, why are we doing this? This is not, however, the be-all, end-all. And that's, again, what I want to emphasize. This is about the conversations and the interactions. What we can do when we have a tool like this is we can have a conversation with our stakeholders, clients, customers, whoever it is that has this question, when will it be done? We can have conversations with them about the input scenario, about the assumptions, about the configuration, about the risks. And then we can have a conversation with them about the outcome of this and how risk averse are they? How important is it that they meet a certain date? If it has to be done by Q2 23, then I think we can all look at this and say, well, we need a new plan, right? That's just not something that's realistic. But I've had risk-averse clients who really want to focus on the green part, and I've had very aggressive clients who want to use some of the yellow ranges. And so that is a thing that they can think about is how much certainty do they need in a given delivery date. And you can also see how wide the gap is between even 85% and 100%, where that green is. Because as you get higher up there, it's diminishing returns. Inverse, but you know what I mean. Okay. Kind of abstract. Let's see it in action. Anybody remember highlights for children? Okay, staple of dentist offices when I was a child, and fantastic magazine. But there was one particular part of highlights that I really, really liked, and it was Goofus and Gallant. Yeah, head nodding, fans. Okay. Now, if you're not familiar with this, Goofus. They were given a scenario, they were given the same situation, and Goofus always did something the wrong way, and Gallant always did things the right way. And it was interesting to see the difference. So today, we're going to look at Team Goofus and Team Gallant. So Team Goofus has poor code quality, therefore erratic sprint velocity. This is their situation. That we have some historical data, right? We might track historical data to sort of see how a team is performing over time and those kinds of things. And so their velocity is 4, 5, 10, and 11. Their average is 7.5. I know I said integers earlier, but bear with me for a minute. Team Gallant uses best practices to minimize rework and defects. Might cost them a little bit more development time up front, but they have higher quality. They're minimizing defects and rework. And this is, I think, generally something we would shoot for if we can. And so when we look at their historical data, 6, 7, 8, 9, the same average, 7.5. Now, they have the same average. Now, I'm not super clever here. Scientists or mathematicians have known this for a while. And standard deviation is the difference. And you can see here that the standard deviation is wildly different between these two teams. Now, again, this is kind of abstract. It's easy to look at the numbers and say, great, less standard deviation is better. They're more predictable. But it's also very easy to visualize. So, quick guess, which of these is Team Gallant? The top, yeah. And so this is a powerful technique when we talk about probabilistic forecasting, is visualizing uncertainty, probability ranges, and distributions in a very easy to understand way. Now, I've gone ahead and lined up here, and you can see how all of Team Gallant on the top is contained within this small subsection of Team Goofus. Now, there is certainly a world in which Team Goofus has a streak of luck or good work, good sprints, and they get it done earlier than Team Gallant. That's certainly possible. But there is also quite a few possible realities in which Team Goofus gets it done much later. And so what do we value? What are we trying to do with these things? Is it increase predictability or the accuracy of our forecasts? These are the kinds of things we need to talk about. And so yes, as we said, Team Gallant on the top and Team Goofus on the bottom. We can make these differences very visual. All right, testing the actual outcome against the forecast. If we use a technique like this and we have these probability distributions, we can do this too. We simply take our distribution that based on the assumptions, right, based on the conversations, the one that we moved forward with, and we start plotting reality against it. Well, of the range of backlogs on the y-axis, where did we actually start? That's our first data point. Let's drop it in there. And we know that by the time we end the project, the backlog size might have changed. That's okay. And then after the first sprint, where were we? Data point. Where were we next? Data point. Next, data point. And you can see that we are within the probability distribution here of all of those different scenarios. And that indicates that reality is probably matching at least the scenarios that we've projected here. That we are within the bounds of sanity, if you will. Now, if that line continued, you can see how it's gotten closer and closer to the edge of the probability distribution. If it started to exceed it, or it stayed at that edge too long, those are the kinds of indications. Very visual, very easy to see, that indicate that we might need to change things, we might need to reforecast, we might need to change our parameters, our assumptions, or otherwise rework our scenario. Oh, yeah, that was just an example of it continuing to be on the outlier. And we can update the forecast with new info. So we can come back, we can change this pretty easily. We can update the start time, the backlog, we can reforecast from any point in time. We can look at a new probability distribution starting at a known point, which is now. Just like with the hurricane example, we can always continue to reforecast moving forward. Another thing that's very important is when we're talking about uncertainty, one thing that comes up are outlier events that might have a dramatic impact. So the example I gave here is rewrite the front end in a new framework. Anyone tried to do some big rewrite in the middle of a project, tackle some big thing, and maybe didn't go the way you wanted? A few head nods. Okay. All right. And so now I've exaggerated the impact here. I don't know that it would be 20 or 30 stories. I don't know that it would be 50%. I exaggerated it to make it a little more visually impactful. But these kinds of things we can also take into account with our forecast, and we can see visually. And so if it's a big enough impact, you get a very bimodal distribution here. And so you can see that there's a cluster of possible end dates, and then there's a gap, and there's a big cluster of other ones, whether or not this big risk materializes. Do we know now if we need to rewrite the front end? We don't. But we can model that, and then we can have that conversation with our stakeholders. And we can talk about, well, what is the impact if we do need to rewrite? What is the impact if we don't? Are these dates acceptable? What's that look like? And we can talk about leading indicators to detect these risks materializing early, all these kinds of risk mitigation techniques. But the very visual part here is important, and the conversations that the tool drives. All right, so we're going to talk about communicating that uncertainty and the language for doing that. Because again, I presume that we're not talking to mathematicians here. We're often talking to business stakeholders who might have a head for numbers. They might often be good at the business side, but the software can be a little different. And so a language that I've found really useful to do that is the language of bets. I think we all intuitively know what a bet is, what it means to place a bet, what it means for a bet to pay off or to not. And so there is certainly for example, poker here, classic sense of a bet. But I'm going to go over the components of a bet in just a little more detail so that we're all speaking the same language here, and we can talk about this with our stakeholders. And yes, I have used this often with stakeholders, with business folks, and it's actually very intuitive. It's a good conversation, and they really do gel with that language of bets because it's easy to understand once we go over the pieces. So a bet has a cost. Now, certainly, the cost could be dollars, budget, headcount, billable hours, whatever the mechanism is that is important to those stakeholders that drives certain decision-making processes, some sort of monetary aspect. It could be reputation. I certainly put my reputation on the line wearing this today. Hope it paid off. I got a lot of comments and conversations out of it. So I made a bet that dressing like this would make the talk a little more memorable and drive some interest. The important part is that with a bet, you're putting something on the line that could be lost in service of a potential gain. I think that's pretty easy for stakeholders to understand. And there are some odds. What are the odds that Batman is the world's greatest detective? That he could figure out a so-called villain's, I'm innocent of course, riddles, right? If it was guaranteed, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't need these tools. It'd be a lot easier. There's a famous quote by an ancient Greek software engineer, Heraclitus, that I really like. No one ever steps in the same code base twice, for it's not the same code base, and they are not the same developer. At least one person snickered, so this made it worth it. Thank you. We're never doing exactly the same thing twice. Now, we may be able to leverage our experience or the tools or the processes, right, to make these things more repeatable and to make them a little easier, but we're never doing quite the same thing twice, and there's always unknowns. Anyone done exactly the same thing twice in their career? Okay, perfect. And the final part of a bet is an outcome. At the end of this scene, Batman will or will not dispose of this bomb safely. By the way, Adam West, best Batman. I say that as a villain anyway. Thank you. I'm glad that some people agree. Everyone else, it's okay to be wrong. That's why you're here. And if it is the Adam West Batman attempting to dispose of that bomb, well, I'm sure the odds are 100%, so we don't really need to talk about that case too much. But any other Batman, they may or may not. And the nuns, well, we won't finish that sentence. The point is, there are some outcomes, possible outcomes, that eventually collapse to one outcome. So we need to communicate that uncertainty. We use bet language. That is one way to do it. I've found it very successful. Bets have cost, odds, and outcomes. And the pieces that we've talked about before. Now, the last thing that I do want to point out, though, is that all of this, as a reminder, is in service of the assumptions and the conversations that we have of identifying risks, enumerating those possible outcomes, right? Maybe it's easy to say Batman will or won't dispose of the bomb, but maybe there's nuance. If you have seen that scene, he runs through a variety of places that are all even worse places to dispose of the bomb than near the nuns, and it's a great scene. I suggest you look it up on YouTube. So there are possibly other outcomes that we should consider. Forecasting and bets identify assumptions, enable conversations. They build trust by letting us be transparent with what's in our head and the impact we think that will have, or how we think reality will play out based on that scenario. And so I have absolutely put all of those assumptions, risks, those numbers in front of customers, stakeholders, clients, and worked with them to talk through what those assumptions mean and the impact it has on them. Time for the case study. This is my favorite part. So, raise your hand if you've seen a pothole in the last 6 months. Okay, everybody, yes. All right. So for this case study, a startup came to us with an idea. They said, hey, pavement degrades over time. Duh. But cities, towns, and counties don't have enough budget to cover all of the needed repairs. And they had a suspicion. Their startup hypothesis, if you're familiar with that concept, was that they could recommend to those cities, towns, and counties a better way to allocate that budget, to spend that money. If you went to Jordan Thayer's talk this morning on AI for highway maintenance, this is that case study. I'm going to look at it from a different angle. Don't worry, I'm not repeating anything. But this is how we worked them through the process of building that product by using bet language and by helping them understand the uncertainty. They had never built a software project before, or a product before. They were a bunch of civil engineers. They built lots of roads, but they were relying on us to not just build the AI, but to coach them and walk them through this process, to make them comfortable with the process of building software. All right, so they recommended this idea, or they came to us with this idea, and they said, we need to know if this will work. And we said, great, we've done a lot of these kinds of things. Let's start with product market fit, time to market, unknown unknowns, the legal framework, the complexity of their solution, right? All these different things. So bet number one was really them saying, can we make this happen at all? We worked through each of these things with them, and the particular way that they wanted to approach this problem resulted in very low confidence. This was uncharted territory for them. And when we started talking about some of these things, the time to market was too long. These are, leaning on lean startup practices and those kinds of things. But we did it in the framework of them placing a bet for literally the existence of their company. They're a startup, after all. They have very limited runway on this approach. And what we found was they were extremely confident of the idea they could recommend better allocation to their customers. But they were very, very uncertain of the particular way they wanted to do it. And so this conversation was a very, very small bet. Took about an hour. We talked through some of the things. I say that the odds are 100%. I know, I just said nothing's ever certain. Give me a break here. Because I was confident that at the end of that hour, they would have a much better idea of what they wanted to do and how they could do it, and the feasibility. Maybe that's just how confident I am in our ability to talk about these things. But the outcome was to brainstorm the risks, the feasibility, to have that conversation with them, and lay out for them the possible futures. Now, we didn't actually build a forecast at this point. We were talking much, much bigger ranges than what I would go through the effort of making a forecast for. But what it did lead was them remaining confident enough in their hypothesis that they said, yes, let's move forward. And so we charted it out for them, and we said, here are some ways to go, here are some ways we can build things. And we moved on to bet number two, 1 week of discovery. Now, I capitalized the D in discovery because for us that is a service offering. It is a week of brainstorming. It is yeah, cost is 1 week. The odds, I called it 90%. Again, I'm very confident that we will learn enough to justify that investment and that they will have a better idea. And we're reducing the possible futures by going through these efforts of drawing on whiteboards and putting up sticky notes. You can see one of the graphs there is what's common among competitors and what's lacking among competitors that we have. So we're talking about competitive analysis and strengths, weaknesses kind of thing, and so on. So we spent 1 week brainstorming, divergent thinking, lots of activities, filled up whiteboards, filled up quite a few whiteboards, did some design studios, service maps, all these different tools that we might think about. And near the end, we converged on what we learned. And what we decided was, of all the possible futures, the best one to pursue was a SaaS offering, which would allow a customer to upload their data, their needs, their parameters. We can parameterize this and make it configurable. And then their customer had a self-service portal, which would advise the allocation of the budget to them. And so that led us to bet number 3. This is the most likely thing we should pursue. Is this feasible? We need to move forward. So we tried again with this bet language. Now, this one was 8 weeks, so we're talking a bigger investment, right? We have built ourselves up. We have built trust and confidence that we're finding a valid path forward. I gave this 75% odds because at this point, a lot of the conversations were about product market fit, and they had to make a go, no-go decision about the big bet. And so what would they actually build? If anything, would they pivot the business to something else instead of a SaaS offering? In these 8 weeks, we really identified 2 particular things. Feasibility question number 1, so I call this bet 3A. Can AI produce good enough budgets in a short enough time frame? If you went to Jordan's talk this morning, you already know the answer to this, but don't tell anyone else, don't spoil it for them. And bet 3B, market feasibility. Does the market want this product, and how would they use it? One of the interesting cases that we found was that the distribution of ages among the possible users was very bimodal. They were either pretty old and they'd been doing this for a very long time, and the tendency there is to be rather resistant to change, or they were very young and very excited for a new tool. And we had to understand, does this generalization hold? We heard it from a few possible users, but we needed to make sure that it was validated. Would they want this product? Would they accept it? Do they have the ability to approve use of this product? Or did we need to find someone else as our key stakeholder who would approve the purchase and then enable a user and that kind of thing? So when we talk here about the cost of 8 weeks, that was the time for us to do the market research, the prototyping, the feasibility effort. The odds of 75%, and that 75%, it's kind of a thumb in the wind number. But it's really about, do we think we're going to learn something from this that's going to move us forward in the conversation and in the overall development effort? Even if the answer is no, that's okay. That's still success. The failure mode here is that we have a false sense of security, or we falsely validate that there is market fit, or that our technical feasibility results in finding the wrong answer. So we might think it's good because we made some simplifying assumptions, only to find out that those then cratered the whole project later on. So these kinds of things. And so for bet 3A, technical feasibility, within the span of that 8 weeks, we built our prototype, modeling reality, modeling road degradation. This is, again, Jordan's talk went into far more detail here about this particular phase. But the short of it is that our prototype outperformed the previous best known approach. Just our prototype. We did carefully review it with the stakeholders, with the SMEs, the subject matter experts, and verify that we weren't missing any big dramatic assumptions. We did end up adding a few more on after the prototype, but by and large, it was there. And the ones that we omitted were not heavily impactful. They were optimizations. They were not critical. So our feasibility effort held. And for bet 3B, we did a series of market analysis exercises. So we sat down with users, and potential users, I should say, and we looked at what they wanted to tell the optimizer, what they wanted to tell the system, the kinds of things that mattered for configurability. We learned quite a bit here. We iterated a lot on the concept. But in the end, the important part was not knowing the answer. The important part was validating, yes, There is fit, there is a market that justifies this and who would use it, and it is technically feasible. That's all we had to know. We did not need perfect clarity. If you were at Eric Potter's talk earlier today on better estimates, that trade-off between time and effort or clarity, right? These are the kinds of things we're doing with these bets. We're moving ourselves slowly along that spectrum with minimizing investment at each step and maximizing the gain in clarity or confidence or certainty. We actually did use this technique, so we actually used that tool. What would it take to bring this product name to life? We did do a little bit more activities, so we did like a breadboard UI, a story map, a couple things like that, capability map, to make sure that we were talking about the same scope. But by and large, the parameters that we came out of that week of discovery with that established the scope for the prototype and for the market feasibility effort, we sat down with the development team and said, given these parameters, what are the possible values? We filled this in. What are the assumptions? What are the risks? What are the big unknowns that are still out there that could cause us problems? And we actually sat down with this startup and showed them, well, the histogram, but also the probability distribution here, and said, here's what the possibilities look like based on the information we have today. If this range is unacceptable, if these dates are unacceptable, then we may need to try and buy down more confidence, more clarity, more certainty through some other effort. If these ranges are, and that might just tighten the range, it might shift it, but it's going to give us a better idea of where reality is with better parameters. We looked at this probability distribution here, and I mean, again, I put this in front of them and we had conversations based on it, and we said, look, in my experience, that 80 or 85% number, that's reality. You can count on that number. Very rarely is there a situation where we need the certainty of the 90 or 100% number, and anything below that 85% number, I want you to understand what it means for those probabilities to go down, and what it might mean if say they pick the 80% number, what happens if the 20% materializes, where it doesn't meet that date? The certainty goes down pretty quickly. And so again, the value of this was the conversations that we were able to have with them, the transparency, the trust we built, and the inputs. Now, what they ultimately decided was that they believed what we put forth in this scenario, but the timeline didn't match what they were looking for. They were a startup, they wanted to see time to market faster, and so that bet paid off by giving us the information we needed to have that conversation and to move it forward. And so what we ended up doing was reducing scope, cost, and timeline, and instead of building a SaaS product for their customers, we built a SaaS product for them and only them, so we could get rid of a lot of the niceties to make the UI more intuitive. Because our user base shrank from all of the cities, towns, and counties in the state to 5 people at the startup. And so they pivoted their business into a service business, offering a service to their customers. We were able to dramatically change scope, and so here I've put some dotted lines, and you can see that now the 55% number, range-ish, 50% delivery likelihood, became 100% under the new timeline. So dramatically faster. And so this was the bet number 4, that they could pivot into being a professional services company instead of a product company. And then use our tool to scale their professional services more than any of their competitors could do who weren't using a tool like this. Now, last time I gave this talk, I was still a little shaky on the outcome, but I can confidently say now that this bet has paid off for them. And they are a thriving professional services company. They are still looking at building that SaaS product as they accumulate more money and making that change, but they've, well, not gone extinct. They've continued in this capacity with this pivot, and then they will be able to make a pivot in the future into a product company. All right. That's what I've got. I think I've got just 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to point at this and say takeaways. Think probabilistically, not deterministically. Use probabilistic forecasting. It doesn't have to be with that tool, but in some way. Communicate the uncertainty, and then profit, I guess? Question mark, question mark, question mark, profit. Anyway, so again, I work for SEP. Connect with me. I'd love to chat more. Are there any questions? Yes. So if I understand you right, the question is, how did I come up with these percentages? In each of the different bets? Okay, so each of the different bets was a stepwise effort to gain more information to decide how to move forward or if they should move forward. Because a possible outcome here was they just disbanded and said, you know what, this hypothesis doesn't hold. It turns out we're not going to be able to shift the norms and move forward. And so they went back to their day jobs or something. The percentages here, though, are nothing more than the integral area under the curve for the... I think I'm stepping on it, maybe. I'm not sure. Apparently I'm at 0 minutes exactly. Well, folks, thanks for coming. So the probability distribution that you saw there, somewhere over there, is nothing more than the area under the curve. So it looks at that probability cloud, and it sums up, so for this date, how many of the possible futures were that date or before? 60% of them were, okay, so you have 60% odds of hitting that date, because you can hit any of those dates up until that point. 70%, 80%, working your way up until the very last possible. So the worst possible case is the 100% line. Does that clarify? Okay, and so you also asked a question about scenarios, taking the inputs and then varying them, or putting in, I showed that bimodal distribution with like a risk of rewriting the front end. So documenting those kinds of things is a way that we generate multiple scenarios. It's a way that, so you can end up easily with several different probability distributions or several different probability sums. Yeah. Any of those statistical methods, any of those tools will work here. I was just happening to show the visuals that tool happened to give me because it was easy to screenshot. But the important part is you have a series of distributions, your backlog, so the possible scope, your throughput or velocity, and then if split rate is something that matters to you, the mapping between one story in the backlog often becomes two because of tech debt. We're working in a so let me talk about split rate. If we're working in a high complexity system, then you might often have stories that split. Or if you're working in a legacy system where you don't have as good of infrastructure, things like that keep happening, refactors, tech debt, you might have a higher split rate. So that's a fudge factor for complexity of the environment and the organization too that you're working in. So those parameters are your inputs, but they're really ranges. And so any tool, any statistical method that can look at a range and sample from it will work here. Monte Carlo just happens to be the one I've had the most success with. And this tool is just a front end for modeling Monte Carlo. Yep. Yes, question. Was that tool proprietary or is it publicly available? It is publicly available. I think the only requirement is that you tell Troy thank you, because he put it together and he maintains it. He's got a lot of other spreadsheets for other purposes that are pretty nifty, but I think the learning curve on the other tools sheets and web tools that he has is a little steeper. That particular tool, he's written a number of blog posts. I've written a couple on like the conversations you should have and that kind of thing. So that tool I think is pretty intuitive once you understand the framework around it and the conversations you need to have to establish the parameters. Yes, question. Is that tool something that my organization uses as a standard practice? I might be hesitant to say it's a standard practice, but it's probably the thing we use the most. Yeah. Certainly the Monte Carlo forecasting technique is a standard practice, yes. All right, any other questions from the room? Any on Discord? No? Okay, any others in the room? You're going to have to shout at me because I can't, the lights got brighter, I can't see anything. Okay, well, thank you all for your time. Thank you for coming. I'd love to connect with you. It's hard to see, but it's just my name, Robert Herbig, on all the various services you might want to find me on. So thank you again. Have a good day.